is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit on...
How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words.
Ultimately, the emergency climate comes down to a single number. The concentration of carbon in our atmosphere.
I'm a victim of this whole climate crisis, and I'm not ashamed to say so.
Hi, I'm Oliver.
Hi, I'm Asher.
We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands we are recording today. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and recognize their continuing connection to the land and waters on which we live. We will be speaking with Professor Gerry Nagtzaam today. Gerry is an associate professor in the Faculty of Law at Monash University. His research focuses on the intersections between environmental law, politics, history, and economics. He has written numerous articles and book chapters on international environmental treaties, focusing on biodiversity loss, climate negotiations, and plastic pollution regulation. He has also published a number of well-received books on topics including international environmental treaties and their normative treatment, nuclear waste disposal in democratic states, on the phenomenon of ecoterrorism, global plastic pollution regulation, and forthcoming books on climate justice and the International Whaling Commission. Gerry holds a Bachelor of Arts and Law from Monash University, a Master's in Environmental Science from Monash University, and a PhD from the University of Melbourne, focusing on the development of environmental norms within international environmental treaties. Without further ado, let's dive in. Welcome, Gerry. Would you like to tell us about yourself?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today. Yes, so my name is Gerry Nagtzaam. I'm an associate professor at the Monash Law School, and my areas of speciality are primarily environmental law and policy, mostly in the international space, but some Australian environmental law as well. At the moment, my areas of research include things like climate change negotiations and Australia's regulatory approach to decarbonisation. I do a fair bit of work on biodiversity loss at the international level, with a particular emphasis on whales. And I do a fair bit of work most recently on plastic pollution regulation, both here in Australia and globally. And lastly, I'm interested with a colleague of mine in the politics department. We do work on environmental radicalism, or sometimes called ecoterrorism, which is essentially people who commit violence on behalf of the environment, either against property or against other humans.
I guess to start off with, what inspired you to pursue a career in the research and academia sector, specifically in the area of environmental law?
Sure. It's a really good question. So I was a Monash law graduate in the 1980s. And when I was essentially you guys, I had always assumed that I would become a criminal barrister. So I went to law school. I just thought, I'm going to be a barrow. That's what I was aiming to do. That's what I was interested in. In my final semester, I did international environmental law, and it was intriguing, but it wasn't my passion. I thought it was really interesting, but it wasn't passionate. Weirdly for me, and I will confess to being a bit of a nerd, I love pop culture and science fiction. And at the time, I was reading an awful lot about science fiction that had a kind of environmental edge. And to be honest, it fascinated me. So it came time to choose, and the issues that were being raised in those books and what I was reading about at the time was just intriguing me as an intellectual exercise, but also something I thought was actually important for lawyers to be doing. So I thought I would attempt to work more in the environmental law space. So I came back to Monash and did a Masters of Environmental Science, so I could actually talk to the scientists about these issues and have a greater understanding of them. And then I did a PhD in international environmental law and politics.
In your opinion, What are some of the greatest challenges faced by our country today?
Well, some of the greatest issues, and I think to be first, I'd say if I was answering that question, I would go a bit broader and say that the issues that Australians face are those that we all face. In the problem you talk about, the question you asked, you talk about the problem of anthropogenic climate change. So obviously that's the major issue that we're facing. But built within that is a whole bunch of other issues as well that are kind of linked to that. And they're things like loss of biodiversity. There's an increased use in plastic, which means that we're seeing a lot more plastic pollution, which we need to deal with. So I think all of these issues are important, not only to every Australian, but also to every global citizen. They're the three I've chosen to focus on.
After all, everyone on this planet, we live on one planet. Whatever we do
Correct.
on one part of the earth will indiscriminately affects everyone at the end of the day. So
That's right.
We definitely do need to do a better job of working together to look after our world.
And you did some research and written some books on the topic of nuclear waste disposal. And since we're on the same breath of environmental justice, we have seen many instances of environmental injustice and also in extension, environmental racism, which is quite a contentious topic, where minority and poorer communities are subjected to the impacts of nuclear waste, such as the exports of waste from developed countries to developing countries. In 2015, here in Australia as well, there was the nomination of the traditional land without consultation with their traditional owners that shocked the community. Besides the upcoming referendum, what are some ways that we can bridge this inequality between communities when it comes to dealing with issues like this? How can we uphold environmental justice in this area?
That's such an interesting, but such a complex question. I could probably try to answer it over the next 3 days. So first point of that is to sort of try to figure out what you mean by environmental justice. Are we talking about compensatory, redistribution? What are the issues? And there are many different definitions of what we mean by environmental justice. So your environmental justice may not be mine. And part of that also is that debate around, as you allude to, environmental racism. When it came to nuclear waste, one of the issues that's been there is that, unfortunately, just very quickly, since 1970, Australia has been trying to figure out where to put our nuclear waste in a repository. Now, Australia only has like low-level and intermediate waste, which is mostly medical waste, but we still need a place to put it. We have not been successfully able to do so. So in 2015, that was the Tennant Creek space. They were trying to put it there, which is in the Northern Territory. And obviously the Indigenous peoples of that area felt correctly that they hadn't been consulted. And so that basically that wasn't there. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, so the previous Liberal government had attempted to put a nuclear waste repository in South Australia on private land. But the current Labor government has basically said that they will no longer put it there. They're going back to the drawing board with attempting to find a place. So on the one hand, we need desperately a place to put it because it's sort of piling up at universities and hospitals and at the Lucas Heights nuclear facility in Sydney. But on the other hand, it's the classic NIMBY, not in my backyard. Nobody wants a nuclear waste repository anywhere near where they happen to be. And so I honestly don't know how we can resolve that. If we are going to, you're going to have to get what we talked about in the book as community buy-in. It is possible, and areas like in Spain have shown that if you get community support for what is happening, you may well end up being able to site a nuclear waste repository. But it's incredibly difficult. And again, so you're starting with the point that most people don't want it anywhere near them, that you need to involve desperately the Indigenous people because you're going to need to sort of get their permission, particularly post-Mabo, for the usage of that. And 3, you're going to have to convince that it's in their own strategic interest to site it, whether that be providing for jobs, providing compensation, building schools, better facilities that are nearby.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you mentioned the recent controversy surrounding the South Australia repository that they were trying to build. I did come across an article which touched on this Lucas Height facility in Sydney, which I think is the only nuclear waste dump we have right now in
Technically,
Australia.
it's a nuclear waste generator. We use it to generate the nuclear isotopes that we need for medical practice.
Mm,
So it's
yeah.
not just a waste facility, but unfortunately, because it is there, they tend to put some of the waste in that actual facility, which is kind of just in Sydney itself.
With that being the waste repository right now, they mentioned that they were projected to run out of room for certain types of waste in 2027.
Yep.
So what are some sustainable alternatives that you can think, like short-term wise, that we can address this nuclear waste in this country? Because it's increasing year upon year.
Honestly, there are no short-term solutions to this. The reality is we need to find a repository, and we need permission of the people who live there, whether that be Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to be able to do so. And as you point out, you're correct, we've only got about 3 years. So without that, what's going to happen is Lucas Heights is going to be filled. They're going to have to put another site somewhere, possibly military, because it's easier for them to control at the federal government. But the reality is, as a matter of urgency, we need to get a position. It's either that or send it overseas. There's also talk that with any of the nuclear submarines that we the purchase contract that we've recently done, my understanding is we may also be responsible for the nuclear waste that's generated by those submarines. So that's a problem for a few decades from now. So we do need a repository, and the government needs to get started on it immediately.
Recently, there's also been an increase in discourse around nuclear waste disposal in an international scale, and the potential hazards it poses to the environment. Following Japan's announcement to deposit treated nuclear waste from the Fukushima disaster, despite Japan's assurance that the country would adhere to international safety guidelines, there are still many who are not convinced and are still apprehensive about the safety of the test and the sheer volume of the waste that would be periodically disposed. In the grand scheme of things, along with many other countries disposing large amount of waste into the ocean, do you think this practice is sustainable?
No. Nuclear waste, we're not allowed to dump nuclear waste in the oceans, and we haven't been since 1954. Now, the nuclear wastewater is an interesting one, and I must call out China here for being hypocritical about it, because China also releases its radioactive waters, technically treated, into the oceans. Now, as an environmentalist, I have read some of the studies, and they indicate that it's reasonably safe. But anytime you're dealing with radioactivity, we're not 100% sure of what the outcomes might be. I think it would be better for us not to release that into the oceans. Yeah. And that's true for any country, not just Japan.
And because they have like certain thresholds that they cannot exceed, but even with such guidelines in place, if such practices are problematic, what alternatives can be proposed to deal with this nuclear waste?
Well, the first one would be to stop using nuclear power, would be my humble opinion, given that renewable energy is cheaper and comes without any of the problems of nuclear generation. Here in Australia, over 1/3 of our electricity now is generated by renewables, yet every year you read about that the Conservatives, and particularly from newspapers like The Australian, are very keen to promote building nuclear facilities. So my first thing would be to sort of say, phase them out. All right. Nuclear waste, particularly at that level, some of it's going to be around for 10,000 years. Something will go wrong. It's just, law of nature. So if we can't do that, then I think they will have to be stored somewhere in some form of repository. Yeah. So you can dehydrate the water to some extent. What's left behind, you'll basically have to store somewhere safely.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because after all, the ocean body is something that is shared among like different nations. So how could international legal instruments promote better care of this shared ocean body that?
The reality is that we have so many laws that relate to the ocean, starting with UNCLOS, the law of the sea. So it would be a matter of basically ensuring that is as well enforced as it can be, and that there are more provisions put in about it. To be honest, we've treated the oceans as a giant toilet. We basically dump a lot of our waste in there, whether it be plastic, whether it be sewage, and whether it be dumping from ships overboard. We've done it for centuries. But given the scale of humanity at the moment, that is damaging the oceans. So we need to stop that practice. Then you can break it down into there are other types of conventions relating around to fisheries and the use of biodiversity. The new one, the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, which is a new treaty that's being signed and ratified this year. You've also got mining that's occurring on the seabed floor, which is due to start at the end of the year for things like manganese nodules. So like any other like on land resource, we've tended to use the oceans as a bluntly unsustainable resource for things like fisheries and various other things. But at the same time, we also treat it as a dumping ground, and that can't continue. So there are a lot of international laws out there, and a number of them should be strengthened, in my opinion, to deal with such behaviours on what's known as the high seas, beyond national jurisdiction of waters.
When you mentioned fisheries, I think it's quite interesting that the Japanese government wanted to deposit this nuclear waste into the Fukushima waters because there has been an uproar from the farmers, the fish farmers in that area, that it would kind of increase stigma around their exports, and that business would be very affected because they had such a hard time coming back up from the disaster and building up their reputation until now. And this would just make them go back a full circle, back to square one. I was wondering, how would the government balance up when it comes to like depositing nuclear waste, economic interest, and interest of public opinion? How does the government reconcile all of these factors?
Okay, so I got points there. China has already said to Japan, if you release the water, we won't buy any of your seafood for the foreseeable.
Yeah.
And they might have a case, particularly because they could go, if it's challenged in the World Trade Organization, there is an exemption there, Article 20, that allows states to say there is a health component to the environment. All right. So how they reconcile it, they're going to argue it's perfectly safe to do so, and it's within range, and it's just a controlled waste release in the same way they put sewage into the ocean. What is everyone worried about? If they are truly concerned about it, then they might provide compensation to the fishers and the local villagers, sort of thing, who might find themselves disadvantaged by what's going on because they can no longer export their market, or they might agree just to buy all the fish and sell it into the domestic Japanese market. I wouldn't have done it, so I'm not sure how they could resolve this.
In a generation where climate change is advancing at unprecedented rate, do you think that traditional environmental activism is slowly treading down the path of radical environmentalism and in extension,
at this stage,
ecoterrorism?
no is the short answer to that. So if you look at some of the other groups that are traditionally considered to be environmentally radical, or eco-terrorist groups, they were willing to commit violence against property. So they might burn down a ski chalet, or they would destroy like machinery at a work site. Or in some cases, the Animal Liberation Front people targeted scientists who were involved in animal experimentation. At this stage, I would say that you are seeing what we would call civil disobedience. So people are gluing themselves to pictures, or they're locking themselves onto the road, or they're causing a nuisance. Now, the problem is, which you allude to in that, is if people feel that their views are not being legitimately heard by the political system, and that the crisis is urgent, which we all, by your question, admits that it is an urgent problem that we need to deal with climate change. If people feel that it's not being dealt with in a timely manner, in a legitimate manner, then people may indeed do those types of violent acts on behalf of their cause. But I can say at this stage, I've seen no evidence that any of the climate activists are interested in that. And generally speaking, climate activists or environmental activists tend to believe that life is important. So they don't, as a general rule, attack others. They see this as some sort of moral dichotomy. How do we prove our case it would just become as bad as the people we're arguing against if we attack them physically. Right? So most of them are very cautious. However, they are willing, these groups, to commit ecotage, which is, environmental or ecological attacks against property. So I would expect, if we do not see government action that is moving fast enough for these people, that a number of them will split off, form a more radical group, and look possibly to attack property. No evidence to date, though. Let me be very clear.
Despite negative feedback and media coverage from the public, why do you think radical environmental groups continue to engage in such behavior to raise awareness for the cause? Do you think we will ever get a unified solution?
I'm not sure we'll ever get a unified solution, given how humans think. The reality is that these groups, in essence, they're not particularly radical at the moment, sort of thing. So Extinction Rebellion and groups like that are not engaging in radical act. But the reality is how effective they are. That's a difficult question. So they may feel they're being effective because they are calling attention to their cause. So, the fact that we've heard of these events that are occurring, they get worldwide publicity. On the other hand, some of the surveys around that indicate that people find such behaviours completely obnoxious and doesn't help the cause. So there's no correct answer here. It's whether or not you are convinced that you want to convince people of the need to do this, and these actions do it. Now, there is a space for radical action sometimes, because it does, and there is some evidence for this, indicate that if you do radical action, sort of other groups like governments and businesses in some cases might be willing to deal with less radical groups. So some academics have pointed out that perhaps what we need to do is, in essence, have a space for radical action, because that leads to corporations or governments being willing, in a sense, to actually engage with the non-radical groups. So I can't answer the question much as I would like to, because it depends on the situation, and it depends really whether people believe in the broader community that such actions are justified and sympathise with them. At the moment, I can't see any real evidence that's occurring. So at best, what's happening is that the attention is being called to the issue of climate change.
Yes, I believe that's exactly right. I guess from a student's standpoint, the limits of what we can do without any proper education in law, what would you say that for the great majority of Australian students and international young adults in advocating their voice and their worries and their concerns on the pressing issues of climate change and environmental injustices?
I would say don't give up, that we don't have time for what is sometimes called the politics of despair, which is the idea that, this is so overwhelming. When I teach the climate law class that I do, after the first few weeks, you can almost feel the room is just so depressed, because you have to describe what the problem is. It can seem completely overwhelming. The issue here is it's really not. And providing we have the, social willingness to engage and resolve this, there is plenty of scope, I think, for young people and old people like myself to basically try to resolve this issue in a timely manner. But if we just give up and say it's too overwhelming, the world's going down, I see pictures of, bushfires and flooding and bleaching of coral off Florida. We don't have time to give up. If we do, then it really will happen.
Just moving on to our next section on the loss of biodiversity. The Worldwide Fund for Nature Australia has reported our country has the most mammal extinctions in the world, and identified habitat loss and also climate change to be among the top factors explaining our observation of ecoterrorism, with the recent rollout of the Nature Positive Plan to include initiatives such as issuing a biodiversity certificate. What do you think are some of the gaps, in your opinion, that have yet to be addressed? And second part of this question, In what other ways do you think that may help mitigate the loss of biodiversity and add to the conservation efforts, perhaps from a legislative policy angle?
All right, well, let's start with the question one first. The first thing we have to establish is that in Australia, we don't know how much biodiversity we're losing. So before we get to the legal and policy aspects of it, we honestly don't have a complete picture of what our loss will be. So the WWF report indicates to mammals, and is absolutely correct, but there are lots of other species, birds, insects, etc., that are in danger of becoming extinct. So the first thing we do, the old EPBC, Environmental Protection Act, basically said within it the government had to maintain an sort of biodiversity register determining what was going on, but they have not yet been able to do it, so they haven't put the resources into that. Second issue, the EPBC Act I refer to, the one from 1999, it was up for review a few years ago and it has proved not to be fit for purpose. Now, I actually personally think that's a mistake, because at the state level there's often an impetus for governments to be working on, more so than sometimes at the federal level, to actually try to put in place large developments, all right, at the expense of the environment, which will lead to biodiversity loss. So ergo, I think it needs to be, the second thing we need to do is improve the EPBC Act. Now, the current government says that they're working on that, and that's okay. The other things you're talking about, they're fine, but they're too soon to know whether they'll be effective, and they really need to be part of a larger review of environmental law, both at the federal level and at the state level. The other thing I'd say is, well, we need to basically take more into account the fact that climate law, climate loss or climate change should actually be accorded an important role in determining projects going forward. So it should be a matter of national significance under the EPBC Act.
What do you think are like some ways that the government should have to reform the EPBC Act to?
It's not my area, not my true area of expertise. There are
Oh,
probably others out there who can really talk to it. But again, putting in place the climate change is a more thing. I think more merits review would be important as
mm,
well. Often what happens in these things is trying to review a decision of the minister has proved to be incredibly problematic.
yeah, and I've read somewhere that there was just one shortcoming in the review, is that they don't include a merits review, but only a judicial review.
Exactly.
And so, yeah.
And so I think that's a major flaw with it.
Mm.
You could also, there's a greater place if you put me on the plate for strategic environmental impact assessment, which is looking at the classic example there is if I build one sort of pig farm, then we look at it individually. What we need to do is give a greater role to the fact there could be 20 pig farms in an area, but if you're only giving permission one by one, you're not capturing the true strategic cost that's involved. There's so many areas we could speak about this. There's forests, there's biodiversity loss, but reviewing the EPBC Act and making it more fit for purpose would be good.
Right.
Here in Victoria, I'm a big advocate for doing what they have in New South Wales, which is an Environment and Land Court. We don't have one in Victoria. We should. All
Mm.
right, specialist judges who understand these issues.
Thank you, Gerry. Just one more question on the topic. We know that there's a lot of action needed to be done in the federal level, state level, but also on the individual level as well. I guess, what do you think are some successful examples of conservation strategies or conservation legislature that have effectively halted or reversed biodiversity loss in Australia or perhaps even abroad?
There are none in Australia.
Wow.
They can be very small scale ones where you might do it at a very local level. But once you start scaling it up, you see very quickly that we have not been able to reverse biodiversity loss. And bluntly, at the global level, same issues. So if the global treaty on biodiversity sort of thing, the CBD, is quite clear that we have not managed to prevent biodiversity loss at a global scale. All right. So yes, I'm sure we can point to some areas where we say we protected that forest, etc., But the reality is, if we look at the scale of what we are doing in terms of deforestation, fishing the oceans to a point where a number of species are going extinct or are near extinction, we have not managed to reverse this loss. So sorry, it is a really key area, and I wish I could give more hope to the listeners. It is unfortunately an area that requires a great deal of improvement by policymakers.
And I also noticed that that you are particularly passionate about the issue on plastic pollution. Now, many international instruments, treaties that have been enacted that touch on regulating plastic production and plastic waste, from the Basel Convention to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. There has been a recent topic about the plastic treaty negotiations in Paris from the UN. Now,
I was there, so yes, I saw it.
Yeah, and so some people have criticized that the contents from this, because the Basel Convention is internationally binding, and so they were worried that, having this new treaty negotiation is just going to be a repeat of the Basel Convention. How effective do you think that this legislation will be in combating this?
That's a relatively silly criticism. So the Basel Convention only applies to trade. So in 2019, the Basel Convention participants, the delegates there, basically declared that plastic should be a hazardous waste. So it falls under the Basel Convention. But that realistically only means that importing states have greater say in rejecting plastics as now a hazardous waste, and they require more paperwork. That doesn't mean that there still isn't a trade in that. Interestingly, the year before, China and a number of Southeast Asian countries said to Australia, we will no longer take your plastic and mixed waste. And they don't, which left Australia in a bad situation because we don't have proper recycling facilities here for plastic. We pretended that we were sending it overseas to China and others to be recycled. So Australia's plastic waste recycling is only about 9%. The government this year said it had climbed to 10%, all right, which is about the global average. So about 90% of our plastic waste is either incinerated or, honestly, it's put in landfill. So we've got that issue. So the Basel Convention the global plastic treaty negotiations that are currently taking place are interesting. You alluded before to plastic production. Now, the reality is all the international laws that are out there that relate to plastic only relate to plastic waste, not to production. But the new plastic treaty, which is only got 2 years to which to be created theoretically, and so they're about halfway through, the next meeting's in Nairobi in November, that also theoretically is looking at not only the problem of plastic waste at an international level, but also the issue of plastic production. And what it wants to do is patent itself on the Minamata Convention on Mercury and the sort of Montreal Protocol on ozone, which basically calls for nation states to actually over time reduce the amount of plastic we are producing. Because the figures indicate that by 2040, at current rates going up, we will triple the amount of plastic we produce. So countries like Australia and what's called the High Ambition Coalition are arguing that what we need to do is not only deal with the problem of waste, but that's only part of the issue. We also need to deal with the problem of plastic production. So in reality, you've got countries that basically want to reduce that plastic production over time. There are other states led by, at this stage, Saudi Arabia, who produces petrol, and we turn petrol or petroleum products into plastic, all right, because it's it's a hydrocarbon. So you've got that, you've got the United States, you've got China, probably India, who are basically the major plastic producers, or in India's case, wish to be, who are looking to basically base any global plastics treaty on only the question of waste, but particularly they want to pattern it after the Paris Accord or Treaty of 2015, which says that states only have to do voluntary action.
The recent treaty negotiation is still at a very premature stage right now, but the UN has set out that they aim to cut plastic pollution by 80% by 2040. Are you optimistic about this number?
Well, given the fact that states in the United States, in like Texas and various other more Republican areas, are busy building petrochemical sites to make more plastic, I'm not 100% sure that I am that confident that I'm optimistic. The reality is, unless the treaty comes into force and America signs it, which is unfortunately highly unlikely, because under US congressional rules, you would need 60 senators to ratify. I do not see that occurring given the current state of the Senate, and next year in particular, given how favourable the map is to Republicans at the Senate level, it's more likely that they will be in control of the Senate. So there's no chance that they would do certain activities within that if they haven't ratified, but it is going to limit their either legitimacy or they're going to be more easily challenged by plastic producers. So it will depend whether or not producer states get involved and actually agree to whatever treaty is created.
I guess just to kind of like round this up, you mentioned in your 2020, there's a 2020 article that all the international instruments that concern plastic pollution, they are just kind of drafted in a very piecemeal fashion, and that an ideal treaty would be verified by things like scientific body and supported by the Global Fund, among others. How does an ideal piece of legislation to combat plastic pollution look like for you?
Technically not an ideal piece of legislation, it would be an ideal treaty. So the treaty itself, in that sense, would need scientists who basically would be able to tell us what types of plastics are out there. So what's the scale of the problem, but also what, if anything, can replace what's going on. We would need, most good environmental treaties have a very strong scientific body attached to it that provide independent advice about the problem and what are some of the solutions that states could have in terms of the technologies that might be out there, so that particularly lesser developed countries can have that technology. So the question then becomes of funding. So for a lot of lesser developed countries who are going to be stuck with a bunch of plastic waste, residual sort of plastic waste, or potentially new plastic waste, how is that going to be cleaned up and who's going to pay the costs of that? Will it be the companies? Will it be developed countries who produce that plastic? Or will they have to fund it? So for us in the international environmental treaty space, the questions are always around who's going to pay for it.
That's right. Thank you, Gerry. Just to finish off for today, can we ask you some closing questions?
Sure, of course.
With climate change and loss of biodiversity advancing at unprecedented speeds, do you see a silver lining about our future of our environment?
I'm not sure I see a silver lining as such, but I have to believe, and you should as well, and hopefully your listeners can, that it will get better. Your generation compared to my generation knows more about these environmental issues. We never talked about them, whether at primary school, high school, or realistically not much at university as well. But the reality is everybody now knows about the issues of climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think most people are broadly supportive of action to change that. So I am hopeful that we will resolve some of these issues. The question is, can we do it in a timely enough fashion?
That's exactly right. What do you think everyday people like working adults or students can do in their capacity to help in this fight against climate change?
Well, they can do what they can to their capacity. So be aware of the issue, perhaps vote on the issue is important at that issue, contribute funds to sort of help if they can, charitable donations, give of their time. If you're a law student, there are environmental law groups out there who could use your expertise, the Environmental Defenders Office, there are so many avenues for people to give either of their time, their expertise, or their money. So don't be afraid, or as we keep talking about, to basically know and understand that every little bit helps, and that it will take a lot of us, if not the majority of us, to actually deal with these issues.
Yes, we should definitely all work towards. For some of us listeners and some of us as law students who want to pursue a career in the environmental law sector, do you have any advice or any words of wisdom or guidance for us?
That would be more along the fact that at the moment there are more avenues for people to pursue environmental interests and environmental law than ever before. Certainly more than me when I was in the 1980s. So there, as I mentioned before, there are lots of environmental groups that need lawyers. There are lots of the Environmental Defenders Office. There is a National Environmental Law Association comprising environmental practitioners and academics who come together. And if people are interested, the meeting I think is in early October at Melbourne Law School this year. So people can go along and actually talk to the people who are working in this space and maybe contribute. So there are a lot of avenues. There are internships with everything from the United Nations Environmental Program to various bodies who are interested in this space. There are so many courses available to them now, both in the law school itself, but master's programs overseas, elsewhere in Australia, that focus on environmental issues, sustainability, environmental law, diplomatic stuff. They're all available to students. So there is a lot of avenues. I would say pick the one that's of most interest to you and basically go for it. Don't be afraid to do so. The reality is being an environmental lawyer, I think, is an important job. And I hope more students, particularly law students, actually are willing to take that sort of role on in the future. We're going to need them to.
We would like to thank you on behalf of the Law Student Society and also the Environmental Justice Group for really allowing us to interview you and also let you share some of your words of wisdoms and also let us hear about your journey and how we, in all of our lives, we can all contribute to a unified solution.